Thank you very much, Chaim, particularly for convincing me to participate in this session. I'm going against my philological soul, and I will not be talking about sources, but I think my goal and my task is kind of to set the stage for a conversation about media and halachic literature. Now, my take after I set that stage will be on the earlier, the formative stages of halacha, ironically, which seem to not have any media in the sense that they're oral, Torah Shabbat Peh, but we'll get there. So I think the first session, which I was able to hear most of, and this session, we're inspired by work that's been done really throughout the 20th century, but especially in the last few decades, book studies and book studies that are connected to religious revolutions. I think the biggest name, even though she synthesized earlier stuff, is Elizabeth Eisenstein, who's The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, which was published in 1980, most forcefully made the argument that the printing press, the invention of the printing press, was, I think she calls it a hidden revolution, which led to all kinds of very deep social historical changes, the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and she sort of reinvigorated interest in media and the role that media plays in social change and historical change, and also in legal change. The question really is, how can we look at, in this session, the access to knowledge, right? And study the access to halachic information, not merely as how do you get to the data quicker, but as an end in of itself, right? The journey is what we're looking at. How does this journey, how does the accessibility affect the nature of halachic discourse? In particular, and this is what interests me, how do we do this when what we're ultimately describing at its very base is oral? First of all, the designation of this material is Torah Shabbat Peh, and the fact that the earliest halachic works that we have, the Mishnah, right, and the Tanaitic sources on which it is based, are oral. Does that mean that we can't apply this sort of lens to thinking about media and the formative stages of halacha? Or perhaps we need to just use a different lens to think about which types of media one can even consider when thinking about orality. Now, that focus, which I'll get to in just a minute, can, I think, even teach us specifically about what's going on today with digitization. In the first session, Rabbi Schechter made an interesting comparison between the printing press and the flood of information which it brought on with all of these social repercussions, and the digital age. I think we can do something similar comparison. It's not a complete comparison, but similar comparison with orality and digitization, and that's ultimately where we're going. So let me first set the stage, and let's say talk about 5 or really 6 stages in the media of halachic literature. The first stage, this is going to be an oversimplification, but the first stage is the oral stage. And the oral stage, as much as there were great debates in the Middle Ages which raged about whether the Mishnah was written down, the consensus pretty much is that the Mishnah was not written down. The Mishnah was published orally, Torah Shabbat Peh, Pshuta Kamashma'a, and really, writing down of Mishnah and even of the Talmud Bavli did not take place until centuries later. So the first stage is an oral stage, and we'll get to describing the particulars, but that is the first stage, and it's a real thing. The next stage is very short-lived, extremely short-lived, and that is a stage of the scroll, right? The scroll for halachic literature, we have a few examples of this in the Geniza. There's a fragment from Chulin. There's some fragments of Mishnah. There's a few more fragments of Batra and a few other Masechtot. I'll discuss in just a minute the significance of this, but scrolls were used. We have hard evidence that scrolls were used for writing down formative halachic texts until about the 8th, 9th century. They're referenced also, the Rambam has a reference to Gvil for halachic text. So that's a very short-lived stage, but it exists. We have, of course, letters and responsa, where the materiality might not necessarily be terribly different from the other kinds of halachic writings, but the formula, the type of language, and these letters go back, really, are already present in the classical period. But the next stage we want to think about after the scroll, famously, is from the scroll to the codex, right? And the codex becomes the dominant mode for transmitting halachic knowledge and these early halachic texts. And in just a moment, I'll focus on what the difference is, let's say, between a scroll and a codex for our purpose. The codex lasts until the printing press at the end of the 15th century. And at that point, we have the printing press. And the printing press lasts more or less until just a couple decades ago when we have digitization. Okay? So we have, let's say, 5 or 6 stages if we want to think about the different types of media that are used to transmit halachic literature. Now, most of us, I think, part of this conference and these sessions are focused on the dramatic change and the sense of newness and the sense of a break with previous modes that we encounter with digitization. When we think about digitization in the digital age, we're thinking at least of 2 things. We're thinking about, first of all, the accessibility to huge amounts of information, which was described in detail in the last session and will be talked about today as well. The other side of it, and that's what I want to focus on, is connectivity. In other words, it's not simply that there's a lot of data out there that you can access very easily, but we are connected to one another in ways that are fundamentally different than in previous periods. In terms of the text, the digital text as language that connects different people at different times, part of this is that it happens immediately. Part of it also is that many of these discussions are visible, particularly in the case of social media. So we have the accessibility to huge amounts of information and to connectivity. I think most of the focus here is going to be on that access to large amounts of information, but I want to talk about the connectivity, and I want to do it now in a way that maybe brings us back to appreciating the oral period and how the oral period is related in a way to this side of digitization. Let me just, before I do that, say and stress that media matters. So in those different stages that I charted, the media matters. It's not simply how I access, but how that access affects the knowledge. Let's take the example of the scroll. Right? And the scroll, again, is a very short period, but it's there. The scroll has its advantages. First of all, the very fact that it is in writing means that we don't have to worry about memory loss. We don't have to worry about even the human element in terms of the preservation of these texts. So it's written down. At the same time, it's in a scroll, which means that it's very difficult to access different parts of the text. In order to get from the end to the beginning, the beginning to the end, and to the middle, you have to roll this thing. Generally, they're not very portable. So there are well-documented advantages and disadvantages of the scroll and what it means for the development of literature and halachic literature. There's a certain linearity of a scroll, which will have an effect onto how we conceive of this as a text. The minute we go into the codex, right, which becomes the dominant mode of transmitting this, there's a fundamental shift. First of all, they're often far more portable. You can make them smaller and less cost. But more than that, there's the random access feature. Right? So there have been studies on what the move to the codex does for the history of knowledge and the history of religions. Again, in the Jewish context, it's not, in the halachic context, it's not a dramatic shift. In the case of, let's say, early Christianity, it's a dramatic shift. Right? It really changes how the religion spreads, how people think about the canon, and that sort of thing. So media matters, and if media matters, then, if media matters, then how does it matter, and how can we talk about it in the case of orality, right? What does it mean to talk about the media, or a medium of an oral text? And how might that inform what we're confronting today in the case of accessibility? So an oral text, what is an oral text? It's not simply people talking, right? The fact that it's a text means that there is a relative level of constraint, of permanence even, on this linguistic expression. There's a formulaic feature, but even more than that, if we want to think of the medium, right, of oral literature, besides the human bodies that embody it, it's the organization. It's basically organizational technology. We sometimes forget how radical the creation of the Mishnah and really Tanaitic literature is, not simply in collecting all of this material and producing it, but in the organizational technology. Right? Other Jewish texts and other Rabbinic texts are using the Bible as its cataloging system. We have midrashim, we have even Tanaitic midrashim, which use the organization of Shmot, Vayikra, Sifra, Sifrei, to organize the knowledge. What the Mishnah does is it develops this 6-order system, and it has Masechtot in that system. And within that system, knowledge can be organized and moved in different ways. Right? That is something that was an innovation which helped the oral texts develop and at the same time be transmittable and more permanent than simply ephemeral linguistic expressions. More than that, right? Because it's oral literature, it has to be embodied. And it has to have a network of people who are in constant contact so that they can build these texts and transmit these texts to one another. With the scroll, with the codex, you write it down and it's there as long as someone has the linguistic ability to interpret it. With oral text, it's all about the network. It's all about connecting. Now, that might be an elite network. It might be a network of simply a very small portion of the population. But the connectivity, right, of oral text and of the oral law, right, is a key feature. I think we could say the same thing about the digital period. In other words, the digital period, besides providing access to knowledge with a few clicks, it also created new forms of connectivity. There was, and I think it's dead at this point, but there still are blogs. But there was a very robust period of Jewish blogs that challenged rabbinic authority. It's still present, but it has shifted and morphed in certain ways. Those things are based on different forms of connectivity, not simply the access that these people had to text. It's still taking place over social media. The discussions that are happening on Facebook are based on a principle of sharing text between different people in real time, and then turning that into some sort of permanent expression. I just want to close by asking, and I'm not going to answer this question, but hopefully we'll talk about it in the discussion, well, what does this actually do? In other words, if connectivity has kind of come back, and even theorists of orality talk how our period as a period of second orality or something of that sort, right? If that's what's happening with digitization, well then what might this mean for halakhic authority, with access to halakhic knowledge and how halakhic decisions are made? There was a book written by Talia Fishman that came out in 2011 that asked these questions specifically about an oral Torah and an oral Talmud, right? Before the Talmud became a book, both in the physical sense and in the organizational sense, right? She argued that there are different ways of taking decisions. Cases were more important even when they contradicted with the text of the Talmud. Can we talk about similar sorts of phenomena that are happening now, even after the Talmud has been canonized and bookized and that sort of thing? So I leave that question open, and I look forward to hearing from